Okay, so in this episode, Auntie B and I are wrapping up season 1 by diving into the key themes and top tips from the incredible series that we have just recorded. The stories that we've shared so far have been amazing. It's been so joyful to share all of the stories and be witness to such incredible journeys and amazing humans. So what we wanted to do was get together and really create a bit of a space for a synopsis of the key takeaways from series 1 before we embark on series 2, which is coming soon. So let's jump in.
It's been so great being attached to this project, actually. I was just reading through some of the show notes and I hadn't quite realised when I took on the production editing of this that it would be so enriching to just hear all these stories myself. It's really fun to now reflect on what I learned as I was messing around with the timeline and, getting rid of everyone's ums and ahs.
They've been so amazing. And I think for me, the biggest surprise throughout it has been cementing some of the things that I already thought and knew. But then also there have been some surprises along the way. And one of the main ones that when I was reflecting and thinking about it was that through every single person's story, when they've been talking about their career break or their sabbatical, it's always been in their mind. So there's obviously been this seed from way, way before them actually taking their career break. This seed was planted way before. And so they've been either, attached to emotions like fear or guilt that have stopped them taking it, or it's been this whole kind of been in this constant decision-making challenge, but there's then been something, an event or something that has basically triggered them to take the career break. So when I ask the guests about, what triggered the career break, every single guest goes, I'd been thinking about it for ages, or, I'd wanted to take one for years, but it just wasn't the right time. Or if I think about Katrina, she talked about eat, pray, love being the, little planting the seed. If I think about Jackson, it was the power of one. Danielle said something about overhearing a conversation between her husband and his mum around like life being too short and that they didn't get to enjoy retirement before his dad passed away. So all of these stories start with this whole kind of that there's always a seed, but then there's a trigger that makes them take it, and whether that be redundancy, whether that be a restructuring in a company, whether that be, I think Annika said it was her Australian passport coming through that was the event.
Yeah, I was going to say that, yeah. Like it wasn't like a massive dramatic event for her. She actually just wanted to, she was less satisfied with her own business than she thought she was going to be, and then happened to get her Australian passport back, and it was almost like a sign. So it wasn't, that in itself didn't have to be a life-changing event, and yet it was, and she turned it into a life-changing experience for herself.
And totally life-changing. She never went back.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And I think that's the other piece, that it was a surprise that it was a red thread that really joined them all together, but was how life-changing they were. Like for every single guest.
Yeah, I think they chose their timing as well, didn't they? So whilst it was driven by a trigger, when if you think about you as well, like yours was driven by your horrendous experience on a motorway.
Yeah, snowstorm on the M25.
Yeah, but you still chose the time to do it. You didn't just get on a plane the next day. So it was figuring out the right time seems to be a large part of what makes these successful.
I think you're right. You touched on there not being fulfilled by your job. I think that was also a common thread. It didn't have to be that life was terrible. Like for a lot of them, life wasn't terrible before, and actually returning to their current life was not a terrible thing, but actually the transformation that happened means that life was even better. But I think a lot of them, there is that red thread around not being fulfilled by their job or having fallen out of love by their job, or that whole career piece is such a common thread throughout them all.
Yeah, and when we fall into it, don't we? We try and do well at school, and then you try and go to college if that's your thing, or learn how to become a chef or whatever it is, and then you try and get better at doing the actual job and climb the ladder, and then often you don't really have time to have that pause and really think about, is this really going to keep me satisfied long term? And with a number of our guests, the answer was no. But then some of them did go back to it after they'd had their break, didn't they? They didn't just abandon their old life and that was that. I think about Steve, who did change his career, but in such a thoughtful way. The way that Steve Duke talks about the learning that he did and the extensive book list that he gave you at the end of his episode as well. Very intentionally, really working on his mindset, really trying to understand who he is and what he wanted.
He was very methodical, wasn't he? And it's interesting, being a McKinsey consultant, it was almost approached, wasn't it, in that problem-solving way. Like, I'm going to solve for the fact that I'm not fulfilled by my job right now, and I'm going to solve for the fact that what will fulfill me and what do I want to do. And he talked about the whole prototyping, didn't he? And that's where his podcast was born out of, was him having career conversations with people. And so he was like, why don't I just record these? I loved that the prototyping then born a new podcast for him. He touched on the identity being huge as well, didn't it? Be your job and identity being so intertwined.
Yeah, and again, I think that's something that we fall into, but it's partly to do with the environment that you're working in as well. And I think that's quite normal as well. So having the courage to think, or finding the strength to think, actually, work is only a small part of who I am. Maybe some people find that really natural. I don't know, but Steve definitely. It was something that he had to challenge. And who is our lovely pets lady, Tanya?
Oh, Tanya.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about the difference, right? Being this high-flying exec recruiter in New York and then pet sitting all over the British Isles.
I love the way that she talks about other people's perceptions of her as well. And she's obviously very, has bags of empathy and intuition and absolutely understands how people are looking at her and what, whether they're judging her or not. Doesn't seem to care. Just brought that beautiful sense of humour and sort of gung-ho attitude with her. It was just like, no, I just do pet sitting now. I don't really care what those people in New York think of me.
Yeah, how refreshing.
Yeah, to know yourself that well.
She talked about as well, I think, which was a common theme, was shift in how you view money, or the shift in your money story. Because she talked about, didn't she, how actually you can live with so much less than you think you need to live with. And she talked about how much she earned previously in comparison to now, but that actually she's so much more fulfilled and she's happier and she's more content now, earning way less than she was right now. And that, it didn't come down to the fact that the big dinners out and the perfumes, and she really talked about that whole consumerism piece not fulfilling her, and actually now doing what she loves and having the freedom, both time and sort of, creative freedom, is what fulfills her. And I think that money story shift was a big theme throughout, but also in saving for the career break. Yeah. Katrina talked about how she saved for her career break, and it was about compromising on, maybe the apartment that you live on and cutting your rent down. Danielle talked about saving, and she had this whole spreadsheet where, she had the ins and outs and she budgeted for everything, and lots of things were cut down that weren't the necessities to be able to then really lead up to that career break.
There was a lot of responsibility and care taken around that as well. One of the guests, you'll remind me of their name. It's early with me, by the way, listeners. It's not early with Bex. I'm in England, Bex is in Australia, so I'm still waking up.
You're all snugged up and rugged up, and I'm like this sweaty mess on the other side of the world.
The lady who said that she downsized her apartment, or gave up her apartment and lived in a caravan, and then she had the chef.
Oh, Laura.
Yes. So she gave up the apartment that had actually been it had been part of her identity. So she shifted her identity before she even went on her break in order to enable her to go on her break. And I thought that was awesome. So she was in a caravan to save money and had her big map of the world up on her wall, and all her friends were putting pins in where they were going to meet her. So she had sort of started her journey before she physically started her journey, which I thought was a great story.
Yeah, and I mean, her story, my goodness, I mean, how different life can look, right? And how that was also a common theme, was about being planned but not too planned. And I think she was the one that said about, if you're traveling, just talk to strangers and just say yes to things, or don't be too structured in like your itinerary of bang, 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 this is where we're going. Be open to the journey. Because her story was that by speaking to, I think she asked for directions, and actually it led her to her husband. Like, I mean, what a story, right?
And then making do with, touching back on what you were saying about making do with less. And during COVID, when they were stuck in Africa and lived in a car and a tent for however long that was, 3 months, I think she said.
Yeah, in Botswana, in the bush.
Yeah, so making do with much less than she would have been able to think possible. Reverse engineering, I think, going back to the spreadsheet and Danielle, I mean, we know Danielle well, and she is very organised and very, very driven. And she talks about reverse engineering. Lucy Lee was very clear about that. She does it in every aspect of her life, including her work. I know that you talk about it in your episode as well. It's something that you and Tim have done to manage where you are now. So that, I feel like that was something that came out of, not everybody, but a lot of your guests really thought about where they wanted to end up and put the time and effort into planning how that worked out for them.
Yeah, and do you know what? I listened to a podcast this week, and I'll put it in the show notes. It was around not letting past you dictate current you, and it was all about future you actually influencing current you. And so working out what the future looks like, and 10xing, your goals and your vision, and having this big vision and being able to then work backwards from the future so that past you doesn't, kind of keep you safe and tell you the stories that you have. And I think that, yeah, you're right. The common sort of thread was that everybody had this big goal and then started to sort of reverse engineer how they were going to make it happen and how they were going to get there. I think a surprise for me massively was that everybody's motivation was so different, but the common themes really were tied together. And I think the freedom that it allows in that kind of sacred space and liminal time that a sabbatical or a career break kind of creates, that freedom that it allows the individuals to explore them. And I think you mentioned around that whole intentionality thing. Society has dictated, hasn't it, for years of exactly what the kind of blueprint is. And when are we ever taught around actually starting to look inwards and become intentional around all the decisions that we make, or actually what does light us up? What do we want to be doing? And I think it's that freedom that allowed everybody to really start to think about, in a restrained world and normal life and BAU, it allowed them the space to be able to start to explore that. And I think that's where the transformation came from. And for me, it kind of, I knew that, but it just absolutely reinforced that to me.
I think the end point felt like the travel for a lot of them as well. So they were saving up because they wanted to do this. They wanted to take the time out to travel. But then what struck me is that was actually, as you say, that's the transition then, because they really did have that space and time to work on themselves. And of course, like, life doesn't end once you've had a lovely holiday.
No, and the integration piece was actually interesting, wasn't it? Like, if I think back to Jackson and his integration, was it he now uses like a certain soap or deodorant that takes him back and anchors him back to that time, and like the souvenirs that I'd love to see the inside of his house, because he explained it as though, an interior designer would have absolute heart failure. But, all of those different ways that people integrated. Somebody said about when they came back, having a meditation room, like in their house, so that this was almost, if they just needed to, they could jump straight back into this one room and, kind of be back in their sabbatical space or whatever. So lots of different people had those sort of integration techniques, whether they were intentional or not, that really helped them hold on to, as you say, it wasn't just a holiday, it was this intentional sort of career break or sabbatical. I think one of the biggest misconceptions, and one of the reasons that I was really passionate about starting this, was around myth busting. And it's interesting, it's actually an interview that's coming out in season 2, but I've just recorded it. We were talking about this lady taking a career break, and she said about her career break that was about 5 years ago, I think 6 years ago. But I also knew that she'd had a career break recently, and she just didn't touch on it. And I said, why? And she said, I didn't even think about that one as a career break. And I said, why? And she said, because I didn't travel. And I thought, I like them in the fact that it doesn't have to be about travel. A career break, if we think about Jen's story, which was, about how to support a loved one going through a sabbatical, and Chad, her husband, he literally stayed at home. He didn't travel. he didn't go anywhere. She was like, come on, go and see the world. And he was like, no, that's not what I need. That's not what I want. So I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that it has to involve travel. And it totally doesn't.
Yeah, I think one of the other things, we talk about people having a goal and then working towards it, but actually a lot of people feel that they don't know what they want and they don't really understand what it is that they're trying to get to, but they might just feel, so like you said before, the seed's been planted, they feel dissatisfied, they want to do something, but they just don't know what that is or how to get to understanding what that is. And that's where I think bringing a coach in could be quite helpful. So starting to do some of that work to understand what it is that you actually want, like what will make life better and more satisfying for you, and how do you work that into some time away. Not all of us are as driven towards a central goal as each other. Some of us are a bit more aimless in the way that life sort of happens.
No, it's so true. And you know what? I'm working with somebody at the moment, and they approached me because they were on a career break. But when we started to chat through how I could support them, it actually was the career transition piece that I could support with, because they had taken a break because they were totally burnt out and just knew they needed a break. So again, no kind of intentional transformation or anything. However, they gave themselves 6 months to just be and just not have to think about anything or do anything. They didn't travel. They're now at a point where the thought of going back to what they were doing fills them with utter dread. And so now's the time that they want to do the work around that transformation and that whole kind of transition. And, oh my God, I really don't want to be going back to what I was doing for 25 years or 30 years career. And so what is it now I do want to do? And so they'll now start on that journey now after having 6 months, total break. So yeah, I think a misconception as well is that you have to do the work whilst you're on the break. As you said, you can do it before. It's around then using that break as a period of reflection and then maybe doing the work when you're back. I think another misconception I potentially have myself as well, which if you think about all of our guests, I don't think one of them touched on taking a break purely because they were burnt out. And for me, I've always assumed that actually a lot of breaks are taken because people get to the point where they're just totally burnt out and need a break. But actually in all of our guests, that didn't really, I mean, we might have touched on it a little bit, but it wasn't the main catalyst of the break, which surprised me. Now, season 2, I've got a wonderful lady, Amanda, who it's pure burnout that she had to take the break. And what an interesting story. But it's taken me till season 2 to get there. So another misconception that I was like, I almost myth busted myself.
Just have this glorious image of people just walking out of their office and picking up their passport and getting on a plane, but that's really not where we went in season 1 at all. I mean, obviously touching on the main theme is really doing the work to get to know themselves in different ways. And then Steve Duke was very, very intentional. Jackson just threw himself into his experiences on his African adventure. Annika was only really still when she was in one country that she stayed in for 2 months to learn Spanish. Remind me which country that was, I forget. But she was travelling constantly, wasn't she? And then was still for a while. And
she actually touched on the travel burnout.
Yeah.
On the fact that actually she got to a point where she was just so over it.
Some of our guests had a lot to say around the support that they'd had, but then there were others who didn't have support of loved ones, and they actually gave some really good tips on why they felt that was and how to combat that. And I thought that was really interesting, because if you're the trailblazer, if you're the person in your world who has the strength and the courage or the drive or the burnout, whatever it is that's driving you towards this, if other people haven't experienced that and are still doing their day in, day out, and maybe they're not satisfied either, I think sometimes it might be quite difficult for them to support you, that there could be an element of jealousy there or fear for you making a decision that you might live to regret, because they're sort of putting their feelings onto you. And I think that came out a couple of times, didn't it?
Juliana's story was incredible, that in the beginning her husband was totally not supportive, couldn't understand why she wanted to do it, why she was doing it, that this was a potentially selfish thing to do, and that she was, reliving her teenage years and didn't need to. And actually, I think you're right, the courage that it takes to be like, no, I am going to do it. And I think we titled her episode, Stepping Into Your Truth, because it really was, her journey was her stepping into, absolutely for the first time ever, her stepping into her truth and her doing something that she wanted to do and that she knew she needed to.
I thought it was really interesting that Juliana then said that her husband was incredibly proud of her.
Yes.
I think that's beautiful. And then Jen was talking about her husband taking a break and how people didn't really understand what he was doing, but then their friends started to talk to them and say, do you think I could take a break? And
I loved, she named the family the Chain Breaker, didn't she? Because it was also all of the old stories that his family, you know, you never take a break and you're the man of the house and you go to work and you provide and you do all of this. And she was super supportive over him actually teaching their daughter that it didn't have to be like this and that there were other ways and that they could do things that weren't the norm, as it were. So I loved the fact that she called, you know, the family the chain breaker of all of these kind of pre-generational stories and ways of doing stuff. She also talked about the ripple effects of a sabbatical, and it wasn't, I don't think it was a common theme as in articulated through, but actually through all of the stories, the ripple effect is huge. And it's the ripple effect on your colleagues, on the company that you're working for and you go back to, or, you know, the work that you then go out into the world and do. It's the ripple effect on relationships and family. And I think that was almost a theme that I felt through, but might not have been sort of articulated through. But it's not just the individual taking the break, but that sort of ripple effect throughout their sort of circle and their world.
I think Katrina talked about it in quite a nice way as well, from how I remember way back in episode 1. She was talking about people feeling that it was selfish and that they were going to be using up all their money to do it. And she said, but it's an investment in yourself. And it's not just an investment in yourself, it's an investment in your relationships as well. I mean, clearly I'm paraphrasing, but that's one of the very clear messages that seem to have come through from that episode and some of the others as well.
Absolutely. And she talks, doesn't she, about the cost of not doing it?
Yeah.
So what's the cost of not doing it versus the cost of doing it? I think for me, the interesting, really interesting bits were the top tips as well. Because when I listened and reflected back to the episodes, oh my goodness, there was common themes through the top tips, and the number one for me was how many people just said do it. You know, when I said what's your top tip on, you know, somebody who's thinking about or about to embark on a career break, oh, just do it, say yes. Like that was the absolute number one top tip. There's two pieces here. One is the myth around only rich people do it. I hear that so much is, you know, oh, it's okay for them, they can afford to do it, or oh, it's okay for you, you could, you know, you saved up or whatever. And it's like, actually, there's a theme throughout all of the stories in series 1 where people had to really start to save and think about the financial runway. But that also came out, so that was a common theme, but it also came out as a top tip. So I think it was something like 5 or 6 people out of the 10 said, you know, be financially set up. And that was for two main kind of reasons came out of that. One was when they were off, they could actually enjoy it. So rather than be worrying about, you know, where the next pound was coming from or dollar was coming from, or whether they could afford to do this or do that, they could actually just have this headspace to totally enjoy it. And then the second sort of main reason was that when they came back, they had a buffer. I think Steve talked about it in the fact that once he returned to Sydney, it wasn't that he then had to get a job straight away, because he'd actually got that little bit of financial buffer so that he had the runway to be able to start to explore and network and not take the first. I think also Jackson mentioned it around not taking the first job that came up because of the financial piece. He had sort of, you know, a few months to be able to actually make the right decisions and to ensure that all of the reflection and thought process that he did on his time off, actually then he could use to making the next chapter way better. And he wouldn't have been able to do it if he was purely driven by accepting the next job just for finances.
I think I mentioned it a little bit as well. It's like, I mean, my trip was 3 months. It wasn't anything like the length of some of these others, but making sure that we knew we had jobs at the end. Yeah.
And the other myth, actually, you just touched on it there, was length. Common assumption is that a career break is 6 months or 3 to 6 months. But actually, you've got, you know, Tanya still says that she's on a sabbatical, and I think that's like 4 years later or something, isn't it? And Laura's like 7 years later, I still class myself that I'm actually on a career break. So actually I don't think there's any finite time. I think it's longer than a vacation, and it's enough time to create that sacred space and liminal time. But actually, we had stories of 6 months. We had stories of, still class themselves on a career break 7 years later.
So yeah, I'd definitely say it's slightly longer than a holiday, but it's how you choose to use the time as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to your point on the supporters versus the doubters, that was another key top tip that came up, was to almost table your idea first with people that will be totally behind you and support you, so that you don't have that doubt creep in. And so that you're really super clear on your why, on what the reasons are behind you taking it, and have almost that dialogue and that articulation to be able to then not sell it, but actually articulate it to maybe some of those doubters.
One of our guests said, "Don't tell anyone," and that she had such a bad experience of telling people up front and them not being supportive, that she sort of...
Which is sad, isn't it? And I assumed that everybody would be supportive. But again, a myth and based on my circle and my reference pool, but there will be those out there that because of their beliefs and their stories, they're not supportive.
Well, she said, don't tell anyone until you're sure of the way that you feel about it.
Yeah, I think it was Juliana.
And I suppose that's less sad, that she's giving herself the space to understand what it is that she wants to. So she's doing the work, right?
Yeah.
Before she lets anybody else rain on her parade. If I had something exciting coming up, I'd want to tell everybody all of the time. But that's that's just a personality trait.
There were a lot of guests as well that, when giving their top tips, were... And it's a really hard one until I think you've been through it, but is trust the process and actually trust that what will be, will be. And it's a really hard one, I think, for individuals to take away if they haven't had a career break before or had a sabbatical and they don't know what's on the other side. And it's the unknown, isn't it? And it is the fear of the unknown. And it's all very well for the guests who have done it to sort of say, oh yeah, trust the process. But in a way, what I wanted out of this podcast was that actually it does normalise taking a break, and it does normalise people making that choice. And if that's a common theme around trusting the process, hopefully somebody who is thinking, oh, I don't know, and on the fence, actually does just jump in and go, actually, I am just going to trust the process.
Yeah, I hope so too. I think that's the best takeaway. I think it would be really nice to hear what you've got coming up for us in season 2, Bex.
Oh, what you can expect in season 2. Well, more of the same. So more of the same heartfelt stories and the sabbatical journeys that we've heard, because I think storytelling is so powerful. And I, for one, have absolutely loved the conversations that I've been having. And we're actually now got people actually reaching out and saying, oh my God, this is my sabbatical story and this is what I've done and I'd love to share it with you. So definitely more of the same. But we're also going to be adding a fresh layer this time. So in season 2. And alongside personal stories, we'll be bringing on sabbatical experts. So what I really foresee is it to be a platform that helps you plan your career break and really offer kind of practical guidance. And so what do I mean by sabbatical experts? We've got some academics that are involved in the research of the benefits of career breaks, and they also have got their own mini stories because through their research, they've actually interviewed many people. So actually bringing sort of mini stories into it. Think financial gurus coming in and helping us really break down the how to, through series 1, we've had people say, oh yes, financial runway is really important, but actually how do you do that? So financial gurus that can help us actually put that into practice. And then also service providers that can really offer some creative ideas of what to do on your sabbatical. So that is what's coming for season 2, and I'm super excited.
Oh, that's so nice. That's so lovely. And it's actually in a direct response to the feedback that you got from the listeners around Annika's episode, where Annika was providing advice on how to get a job afterwards and how to tell a new employer that you've been on a sabbatical break and how to frame that. And we got such lovely feedback from people who really enjoyed that short bonus episode where she really helped people to sort of plan for interviews and what to write on their CV and LinkedIn. So that's why we thought it'd be really great to bring some more practical tips into season 2.
Yeah, tangible things that the listeners can really take away and implement.
Yeah, and still the beautiful stories of people's transitions and what they learn from their breaks as well. So I'm excited to hear more. I'll be,
me too.
Think of me on my laptop, chuckling away,
over Christmas,
crying sometimes, having a little
happy tears and weeping
whilst I'm eating my sprouts.
And taking matters into your own hands, you won't believe that you're making headway. And plans.
And that's it, a wrap for season 1 of the Sabbatical Stories podcast. At the beginning of 2024, Auntie B and I had an idea to create a podcast that would inspire people with real stories of sabbaticals and career breaks. And fast forward, here we are, kicking off 2025 by wrapping up season 1 and getting ready for season 2. And your support this season has meant the world to us. Listening to the episodes, subscribing, sharing with friends, leaving reviews. It's because of you that really this podcast exists, and we are beyond grateful for each and every one of you who has tuned in. Season 2 is already brewing, and we would love your input. So any themes or topics that you would love us to explore next, please do get in touch. If you've got a sabbatical story to share, maybe you know someone whose journey would inspire others, do let us know. DM us on Sabbatical Stories Podcast on Instagram or message me on LinkedIn. I'm Bex Thomas. Until next time, take care of yourself, keep dreaming big, and remember, your sabbatical story is just waiting to be written.
And deep down you try